If you could try to find some seats and sit in them. For those who can't find seats, if we can keep the volume down and sort of spread to the periphery. So the proceedings will be, I'll be introducing the series of speakers and giving a speech myself, and then Rick will finish up after those speakers and launch the book. We will have a break for a little while after that, and then we will move to a live auction, and after that we will have book signings. So hopefully Rick will not be too exhausted by the time we get to the latter part of the evening. Good.
And the young man very healthy.
Good to hear. Okay, so we're here to launch a biography. And biography is a fairly rare genre in Australian herpetology. There haven't been a lot of biographies in Australian herpetology. What? We'll try and bring this up here. Okay, you can get it up. Now it's not doing anything. Okay, so biography is a fairly rare genre. There have been a few though. So we have Eric Worrell's Song of the Snake. We have another biography of Eric's. We have Ram Chandra's Search for the Taipan. We have Strawn Sutherland's Venomous Life. We have John Cairns' Snakes Alive, which is less of a single biography, more historical, but then John's life himself is celebrated by John Cairns' Snake Man. And then we have Eric Pianka's The Lizard Man Speaks, which was, according to Eric, supposed to be called A Yank Down Under, but the publisher wouldn't go with that. And most recently we have Brian Fry's Venom Dog. So you'll notice there is a distinct theme amongst those topics. Although herpetology is a very, very broad field, pretty much all of the biographies are about snakes and snake venom, people working on them. And this book is basically the same. So we're also going to have a biography by Rick, also falling into the topic of snakes. So Rick is eminently suited to be producing a biography that deals with snakes. He's been a leader in studies of the ecology of the Australian reptile fauna, and particularly snakes, for quite a long time now, right back to the 1960s, as we'll discover. And he's published over 1,000 papers, and he's also had 2 previous books. So there was Australian Snakes, Natural History, and Cane-Toad Wars. And now we have So Many Snakes, So Little Time. So why write a biography, and more specifically an autobiography? Why not just write another book on snakes instead? That's what most people want to hear about. Do people really want to know or need to know more about Rick himself?
Absolutely.
However, if you read this book, you're going to find out that it's not all about Rick. The first couple of chapters do cover Rick's early life, early years, up to his PhD at University of New England and his first postdoc at University of Utah. But after that, you'll find that the book changes tack. It becomes more a series, less chronological, and more a series of biographies of the snakes that Rick has studied over the years, and the students that have worked with Rick in studying those species. With each of those species, one species or a couple of species per chapter, illustrating something about how those snake studies have effective ways of thinking about biology and conservation, and the ways Rick has thought about biology and conservation. So, as we go through the chapters of the book, we learn about his early work on mating systems in black snakes, first at Macquarie Marshes, later at Monterey Swamp on the south coast, which involved Rick's earliest work with radio tracking snakes. And it also led to his first inklings that Australian environments were different from the environments that people had been looking at in the past, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. Australian environments are incredibly dynamic. Sites that appeared to be great for study for Rick turned into complete disasters after a couple of years. All it took was a couple of years of drought or 1 year of severe flooding, and the sites became pretty much useless. The snakes disappeared or were invisible. We learn about the long series of papers that provided the backbone of Rick's data. These involved dissection of museum specimens to provide basic natural history data and vital statistics of size across the spectrum of Australian snakes. And on that was added Jono Webb's work as an honours student on blind snakes. So every chapter involves one of Rick's collaborators. It's not just purely about Rick. These studies, all these guts and gonad studies, continue to be major reference points for all subsequent work on Australian snakes, not just the work by Rick himself. Pretty much everyone working on Australian snakes has referenced those papers. We hear about the ecology and mating systems of carpet and diamond pythons involving Dave Slip, Mark Fitzgerald and Dave Pearson, initiated to answer questions about the conservation status of diamond pythons in suburbia. That was a question that was asked to Rick by New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife. And it was then expanded to explore interspecific variation in ecology, looking at coastal carpets and southwestern carpets. Another field that sort of really people have not really thought about before, the fact there might be variation within species in their ecology. We read about the work on broadheads that was largely run by Jono Webb over many, many years, and the other Hoplocephalus species added on to that, looking at work done by Mark Fitzgerald and Brian Lozel, thinking about how endangered species research links into wildlife management in general, which often proves to be very different for Australian reptiles than for the Northern Hemisphere mammals and birds, which have received so much earlier attention. Then we look at the work by Pat Whitaker on eastern brown snakes under Rick's supervision, demonstrating how many preconceptions about dangerous snakes were completely wrong. Then we move on to the long series of file snake studies, beginning with David Slip and later Darryl Houston, including they introduced tropical reptile faunas and the value of systems with vast numbers of snakes to study, something which really hadn't been thought of before. The huge biomass of file snakes leads in terms to studies on water pythons and the establishment of the famous Fog Dam, or infamous Fog Dam research facility, heavily involving Tom Madsen. Again, questions, messages of how dynamic Australian systems are come through loud and clear, with a sudden crash in numbers after 15 years of water python data due to a few years of heavy rain that took out the rats the pythons fed on. And then finally we come to the studies of keelbacks and slaty grey snakes, again in the same system at Fog Dam, work that was largely done by Greg Brown that leads to changing views on how complex and sophisticated snake ecology is when you look at the details over long periods. So essentially, the book, when you come to read it, I'm sure everyone's going to want to read it, essentially the book is a long epistle on the Australian snake fauna with episodes of Rick's life woven through it. But there are two things that don't come out in the book, for those who are expecting everything of Rick's life. Firstly, Rick's work is not just on snakes. There have been a lot of studies on Australian lizards as well, and these have also participated in major studies on costs of reproduction, evolution of viviparity, and phenotypic plasticity. And ditto, the cane toad work isn't really covered in this book. I guess the cane toad work was covered in Cane Toad Wars. Secondly, this is a very Australian biography, so it really covers Rick's Australian work. Rick hasn't just restricted himself to work in Australia, he's worked on snake systems around the world. But in this book, you won't hear anything about the python work in Indonesia, you won't hear anything about the garter snake work in Canada, and you won't hear anything about his more recent sea snake work in New Caledonia. Hopefully there'll be another volume at some stage. Now, one of the advantages of writing an autobiography is you can control what goes in it. And there are some things that Rick has omitted from this biography, and others things in the biography that shed light on little mysteries in Australian herpetology. Rick does briefly mention how he came to be involved in 2 children's books in the mid-1960s, including adorning the cover of The Snake Catchers. So these 2 little books were published in about 1966. So this gets a mention in the book. And there is Rick with his photograph. So that's Rick on the front cover of The Snake Catchers.
I haven't changed at all.
No, you certainly see the resemblance there. But at the same time, Rick completely overlooks mention of his very first publication. This was a prize-winning essay on red-bellied black snakes that appeared in 1966. It is Rick Shine's School Essays Competition, June 1966. And Rick was aged at the time just 16. Reading that essay, I can see the first faint stirrings of a nascent biologist. There are new observations he'd made on his captive red-bellied black snakes, combining those with a review of the literature. Although there is one little bit there which we still have yet to see those further studies. Several of my specimens have sweated a greyish-black urine through their skin when frightened. I have never seen this mentioned and am investigating. So we're waiting to see that paper come out.
It may have been me doing that.
Yes. Okay, shortly afterwards, we read about Rick's honours work on Cunningham skinks, which is probably the only research project Rick has not actually published yet. Hopefully, we will see something come out before Rick passes on. In chapter 2 of the book, the introductory tale finally gives the information to resolve a long-standing question in Australian herpetological history. If you go back to Rick's paper on Demantia Natural History from 1980, it refers to recovery from a bite by a yellow-faced whipsnake at the Dungowan pub. And shortly afterward, Struan Sutherland, who wrote another biography, but in his book Australian Animal Toxins, Struan bemoaned the fact there were no details provided of the clinical management of the case. Now we have the full story published in the book. It's the introduction to chapter 2, and it's obvious though that more credit should have been given to Rick's fellow student Eddie than to the publican at the Dungowan Hotel for the care of Rick. For the sake of future historians in herpetology, Rick has kindly provided brief descriptions of many of the Australian herpetologists and other senior biologists he's worked with. So these include Al Heatwold, Jim Bull, Charles Birch. I'll pause for a moment to let you read some of those descriptions. I'm not sure everyone will appreciate the descriptions, but I think most will treat it with humour in which it was meant. We have myself. We have Dave Slip. We have Jerry Swan. We have Mark Fitzgerald, Dave Lindner, and Tom Madsen. We have Daryl Houston and Greg Brown. However, there is one person, possibly the one most often discussed and mentioned in the book, who remains nameless. This is an English biologist Rick met at a bar in Canberra while Rick was doing his honours research, who gave Rick the benefit of his knowledge of the value of work on Australian snakes. Very luckily, Rick didn't take to heart the advice he received that night. So this is the first introduction to the unnamed English postdoc. Pops up again on numerous pages. Page 49. page 126, page 225. One day we'll find out who that is. Maybe volume 2 when it comes out will tell us. And finally, we see him again on page 245.
He's sitting here.
Yeah.
Now, going back to my association with Rick, I first met Rick in the early 1980s. At the time I was a young undergraduate student in veterinary science at the University of SYndey and had only recently discovered the world of scientific literature. It was quite a shock to me. Going into university, I knew about what books were available, I knew about Worrell, I knew about Coggers, but the university library system suddenly introduced me to the fact there was a much wider literature out there. So I'd spent much of my spare time at Sydney University as an undergraduate student in the various libraries, tracking down papers, photocopying them, reading them, filing the copies away. At the same time, Harold Eamon, who was involved in the Australian Herpetological Society, was running a night course at Sydney Institute of Technology called Advanced Herpetology. And Rick was involved in giving at least one of the classes in that course. And as a budding herpetologist, I enrolled in that course to learn more about reptiles, and I got to chatting with Rick during the class, and he encouraged me to visit him at Sydney University. I'd heard of Rick, but I'd never met him up to that stage. So Rick's office up to the point was up in the zoology building, just up the road from Vet Science, and after that first visit, I was a regular drop-in to the lab. It was up in the far corner of the zoology warren, with the adjacent room occupied by his lab staff and students. They included at that time Rob Lambeck, Dave Slip, and Craig James, and later Darryl. It was all about this time that Rick had actually moved from being a postdoc to taking up a lectureship at the university. He spent much of the next 40 years in Sydney. Having watched Rick over many years, I've had plenty of time to watch Rick, I've been in the field with Rick, it's clear to me that some of the claims Rick makes in the book are not completely true. So throughout the book, Rick claims he was lucky throughout his career with opportunities opening up at just the right times. However, while there was an element of luck at some points, what doesn't come through is that Rick is a consummate player of the academic game. He has extreme skill in putting together grant applications that tick the right boxes, knowing how to write papers so they get published by the high-profile journals, a necessary process to advance one's career. He can take a single idea someone mentions to him and weave it into a major funded study. He has an instinct for when to jump into a new trend when funding is about to come through. Yet at the start, things were very different. And the early chapters describe an academic world that's largely been lost for research students these days. Things such as being able to do field work on dangerously venomous snakes alone without a vast amount of field work approval, OH&S considerations, a time when reptiles were still not protected, and permits to collect or to visit national parks and state forests weren't necessary. It was a time before animal ethics, when you didn't have to spend more time dealing with ethics committees than you do doing the actual research. And it was a time when there was less pressure to produce immediate results, when pure natural history studies were still seen as something valuable and end products in themselves. A few years ago, Rick and I were discussing our respective careers as we were walking down Science Road together. And Rick's career began in the 1970s, mine the 1980s, and we agreed that neither of us would actually have survived all that well if we'd had to start our careers in the modern day. However, to balance that, the modern day does have its advantages. There's access to a much expanded literature base that's available at the touch of a keyboard or screen. It's very different to the past, where we had hours spent physically searching library shelves for journals, battling photocopiers, relying on punch cards and mainframe computers to undertake statistical analysis. We no longer have to use typewriters and try and correct manuscripts by hand, or later using whiteout. Digital cameras give us instant results rather than having to wait several weeks after the end of the field trip to work out whether the photographs actually worked or not, were suitably exposed and focused. But I don't want to turn this into another version of Monty Python's Four Yorkshiremen. Instead, I just want to close by saying that the younger readers of the book, the aspiring herpetologists of the future, are going to get affirmation that a childhood spent chasing reptiles through the bush and having to deal with disapproving parents can still lead to a career in herpetology. The modern generation of herpetologists will get to hear about what things were like in the past, before they were born. And the non-herpetological reader, who I suspect will be the main buyers of the book, will get a perspective on the biology of Australian snakes that will hopefully put another set of nails in the coffin of the view that the only good snake is a dead snake. We're going to move now to thoughts of another aged herpetologist, John Weigel. Between us, I guess we represent the ghosts of Christmas past. John.